gaining too much distance from nature and the pursuit, which I would call the kind of the liberal dream, which is to completely emancipate yourself from nature, that humans rise completely above nature. And now, of course, artificial intelligence in this vision will do that for us. It will be absolutely separate from nature. And I'm saying at the end of the day, in the same way that the triple lock pension will go, nature will come back. It will call us back if we try and neglect it. So I think being aware of the limitations it can impose upon us is the one thing that I think will sort of inculcate resilience, is just that respect for the power it has, which when you live in a developing country, you naturally form because you're exposed to nature's vagaries so often.
The presumption is that high GDP, affluent, wealthy countries are those best placed to stand up to the challenges of the 21st century, whether it's climate change, pandemics, or even inequality, if we wanted to deal with it anyway. These countries, with accumulated wealth over decades and centuries, can address challenges that poorer countries simply can't. That's particularly true on things like climate change. As a result, we get the claim that those countries most responsible for global warming are, simultaneously, those best placed to deal with the consequences. Poorer countries, less so. And that's deeply unjust. But what if that view was wrong? What if, in fact, our wealth, comparatively anyway in the West, was in fact a source of fragility? What if being so wealthy was a vulnerability, an exposure, a problem? That's a strange hypothesis, you might think, and it's certainly very provocative, but it's at the heart of a new book by John Rapley, Icarus Economics, where rich economies are struggling and how to fix them. Now, you might remember John from a conversation we had not so long ago with a gentleman called Peter Heather. He co-wrote a brilliant book called Why Empires Fall with Peter. That is on this channel. If you want to watch it, you're more than welcome to do so. This is a brilliant accompaniment to it. We often talk about the decline of the West on this show. We're doing it today, but with a twist. John Rapley, welcome to Downstream.
It's good to be with you, Aaron.
We had a great conversation a couple of years ago.
We did. I enjoyed it immensely.
So did I. It was one of my faves. I think that's got maybe 600,000 views.
Oh, wow, I'm flattered.
It wasn't just you, it was also your colleague, Peter Heather.
Peter Heather. He's a bit of a genius.
Why Empires Fall.
Correct.
And you're obviously, well, not obviously, for people who haven't watched that, you're coming from political economy of development. He's a historian of antiquity. And together you had this fantastic, rather short, pithy book about the lessons that we might learn in the West from the demise of ancient Rome in the 4th century.
Yeah. And it happened purely by happenstance. It was just that we were each writing a book, him on the fall of the Roman Empire, me on contemporary globalization, its impact on the state. And we were all friends from our Oxford days. We just happened to bump into each other and essentially started a conversation, said, well, what are you writing? And we were struck when we sort of explained our narratives to each other, how similar they were, though they were very different time frames. And we said, well, we really should explore this. Is there a common narrative? Is there a common thread that runs through empires? And can we think of the Western world as being an empire in the sense that Rome was? And Peter argued rather persuasively we could. And so it took off from there. And, it was an interesting collaboration, but it seems to have worked.
It's a fabulous book. And that was a fabulous conversation. But I recommend books all the time on this show. But people obviously, they do a cost benefit, right? I know you'd love to read The Count of Monte Cristo, but do you have time for 1,400 pages? This is 150, 160 pages.
Yeah.
However, this one, Icarus Economics, is slightly longer.
Actually, in words, it's not, which is interesting. It's just the way they've decided to present it.
Very enjoyable. What made you write this book now? What was the impetus to go from talking about the demise of the West to this, and how are the two connected?
I mean, the book, Why Empires Fall, looks at the decline of empires, the life cycle of empires, what brings about their decline from without. And you would think that this was just the natural progression. Okay, well, now we've looked at the sort of the geopolitical, geoeconomic factors which drive the decline of an empire. What are the internal factors, and how does this play out? Because that's essentially what this book does. But that wasn't the motivation. It was something really quite different, Aaron. It was in the pandemic. I was on my way in early 2020. I was on my way back to South Africa. I'd gone to spend Christmas with my family in Canada. And I flew through London essentially for a brief stopover before continuing on to Johannesburg. And then, of course, we were all locked down, and I was stuck in London for the next 2 years. And I was supposed to go take up a professorship at a university at a new research institute that had been created, and I was basically stuck, with time on my hands and a lot to ponder. And I began thinking about this. Well, I was struck at the fact that what we had, I had been aware for some time that there had been an increase in zoonotic disease outbreaks that were leading to epidemics. And this was the first real pandemic we'd had, but epidemiologists have been saying since the 1990s, there's going to be more of these and they're going to be worse. And I just got to thinking about this as one of the feedback loops, and I started reflecting on, the Gaia hypothesis. I never really was entirely persuaded by the Gaia hypothesis, except as metaphor, which is what most critics in the scientific community would say. It's useful as a metaphor, but it's not actually a thesis. And that's the way I thought of it. I thought as a useful metaphor, this idea that very rapid economic growth leads to environmental feedback loops. And I started thinking about this in that context. Essentially, what you have is when you push the economy to grow and grow and grow, you run up against these walls which limit the growth. And then I started thinking about that. Well, what's happening in Western countries? Because they essentially, since the financial crisis, and really when you look back at the roots of it, it goes back further, as we talked about in Why Empires Fall. They have been slowing to the point that they're almost stagnant, growth of barely 1%, the main exception being the US. But as I say in this book, that's a bit illusory because that is entirely borrowed growth. And it's entirely debt fueled. And unless the United States can continue borrowing endlessly at the rates it's doing, and it's already met the limits of that growth strategy, it too is going to find itself coping with stagnation. And what goes on, and I came up, I started thinking about this and thinking about it in the context of ancient mythology and the myth of Icarus and this idea that such a thing as flying too close to the sun and then you fall back to earth. And I thought, not that I was suggesting that this is actually a life cycle, but I got to thinking about it in that way. Is there something in terms of the way that economic growth leads to the change within a people, within a society, within culture, within the politics of a country that begins to put barriers in place, that slows growth, reduces resilience? Because the other thing I was struck by, Aaron, during the pandemic, in the very early stages, I was having a weekly meeting with some colleagues of mine, just one of these things we did in the pandemic where you get together for drinks online because you can't actually meet. Colleagues at different universities in Britain and elsewhere, and just sort of brainstorming. All of us in this group were either from developing countries or had lived much of our lives in developing countries. But we're all also either working in developed countries. In other words, people who, like me, have crossed the divide and sort of live in more than one world at a time, and we see things differently. And all of us were struck by what very quickly emerged as the sort of official narrative on the pandemic, which is if it's doing this in rich countries, it's going to absolutely devastate poorer countries, it's going to destroy them. And all of us had a sort of nagging sense, well, that's not true. That's not true. We know how things work in developing countries. And all of us had a strong sense that actually developing countries were on average going to pull through the pandemic better for a lot of reasons because of essentially their own social resilience. And that, in fact, turned out to be the case. So it was two things that came together. This idea that we have these external feedback loops, which then create challenges to further economic growth, interacting with internal feedback loops, the way we change, the way our behavior changes, the way our political organization changes, the way the economy changes, that makes Western countries less resilient before these shocks. And I thought, well, let's look at the next big one, which is going to be climate change, extreme weather in particular. How is this going to affect various countries? Again, the dominant narrative, it's going to hit poor countries worse. And I said, well, let's see, is that really true? Let's look into that. And that's where this book took me.
It is such a provocative hypothesis. And, I'm somebody on the left who has lots of these conversations as somebody in the media. And that is maybe one of the most platitudinous of all the platitudes on the left, which is that climate change, overwhelmingly the result of the development of the West historically, is actually going to harm the poorest people in the global south the most. We'll return to that. I'm just going to go over some of the concepts you've said there because I think this is really important. This is the building block the foundation of everything that we're going to talk about over the rest of this conversation. People know what a high GDP affluent country is. You've got different kinds of societies. Some are more successful in various ways, but the OECD, Japan, UK, France, the United States, these are wealthy countries. They know what a wealthy country looks like. And your contention is that the wealthier a country becomes, not only does it generate more crises, not only does growth generate potential crises, such as zoonotic spillover, the more rapacious your model is with regards to nature, the more likely it is that you're going to get, a pathogen crossing from one species to another. So not only does it create more risks, but it also reduces the aptitude and ability of wealthy societies to address those risks. You talk about that with COVID, right? People know what a wealthy society is. What's a resilient society? Because those are the two things that we're trying to weigh against one another. And I presume resilience is a contested term. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's not.
Well, it's interesting because until recently, I would suggest, and it probably is still the dominant view of resilience, would be that rich is resilient, put it that way. The more resources you have, the more shock you can absorb, the more you can adapt. So go back to the pandemic as an illustration. Okay, all these people are going to be sick with COVID. They're going to be hospitalized. Some of them are going to be critically ill. Well, we have hospitals. We have ventilators. We have the medical staff. We also have the deep pockets, the credit that makes it possible for governments to borrow 20% of GDP in order to pay people to stay at home. Poor countries didn't have that. Poor countries didn't have, I think it's in that book where I mentioned the statistic that South Sudan had entered the pandemic with 3 ventilators. And literally 3, not 300, not 3,000, but 3 ventilators. And you look at that, you say, my God, 4 people get sick and the problems begin. But that makes a whole set of presumptions, which I think are very common. I mean, a lot of the people who train in public health obviously are working at Western universities. They've spent their careers. They might do field trips, but they're not necessarily immersed in these environments. You see, well, the first thing that happens when there's any kind of disease outbreak in a lot of African countries, for example, or developing countries generally, but particularly in Africa and South Asia, is people immediately practice some form of social distancing. They immediately practice hygiene. They immediately start masking. That kind of is just something they do because they've dealt with these diseases. So these things come naturally, unlike what was happening in many Western societies where you had a minority of the population, but a very vocal and active one, resisting masking on the grounds that it's a violation of their freedom. Well, they can do that because if they do get sick, they will be hospitalized. But there's a reduction in resilience as a result of that. And there was a certain complacency, even among politicians. I remember in the early days of the pandemic, Boris Johnson saying, I'm shaking hands with everybody. It's not a problem. We've got the best doctors in the world. Well, that may be true, but that is a degree of complacency you don't encounter in developing countries. Let me give you another illustration that isn't in the book, but something I was just reading the other day, Aaron. Somebody predicting, could a super intelligent artificial intelligence take over, for example, the software that manages the tractors, that manages the irrigation systems around the world, and literally shut it down and starve humanity into submission in order to gain control over it. And this person was writing, an American blogger writing this apocalyptic vision and taking it quite seriously. And I thought, well, yes, not in Africa, because they're not using AI. And so the very thing that makes them, we would say, well, they're very backward. On the other hand, it does create this resilience, and also they do a lot more multi-cropping. And so they're not as susceptible to major crop failures and that sort of thing. I'm not suggesting that this is a call to go back to an African type of agriculture. What I am suggesting is that there is a cost. It's not free. Growth and development does bring vulnerabilities, new vulnerabilities that don't exist in a society. And so we have to look at resilience that way, not just what is the resilience with the state, but what is the resilience of the society. And I think that's what's missing in most of the discussions of resilience until now.
Are you familiar with the concept of pace layers? Maybe I mentioned this the last time we had this conversation because this does overlap to some extent with the previous book. It's an idea put out there by Stuart Brand. And pace layers really are one framework by which to understand human existence. The deepest pace layer is nature. And of course, that changes very slowly. If something goes wrong with it, the rest is in real trouble. On top of that, you have things like infrastructure, water, roads, which can last for thousands of years. On top of that, you have culture. And then on top of that, you have fashions, which is, of course, very ephemeral. If something goes wrong with something which is trivia and fashion, who cares? And basically, each of these pace layers going deeper and deeper depend on the one prior to them, right? And often when we think about politics and society and human affairs, we focus on the fashion and the trivia, and maybe we think about the cultural software, maybe, right? People talk about nations and identity and religion and ideology. But I think where the left has been strongest in the post-war period has been to talk really incessantly and insist on the importance of those fundamental pace layers of infrastructure and nature. And I feel like there's some connection between this idea of pace layers and what you're talking about with the Icarus effect, which is to say if there's too much of a juxtaposition or a disconnect between the pace layer of a culture and of fashions, which I think basically we're living in with regards to the society of the Great Acceleration. We'll talk about that more in a moment. But if there is such a profound disconnect between those two top layers and the natural one, things go very badly wrong. And as somebody who wrote a book called Fully Automated Luxury Communism, I've read a ton of criticisms of the book. Most of them are rubbish. I'm not just saying this because you're in the room. This is the best criticism of fully automated luxury communism, this particular page. And you don't mention the book or mention me, why would you? But it really got me thinking. So here we go. Beyond this, our discussion so far raises an even more radical possibility about the neoclassical utopia. A so-called shallower existence characterized by material abundance and large-scale eradication of all forms of adversity, from even minor disease to falling asset prices, may actually make society less dynamic and resilient, and therefore more vulnerable to shocks coming from nature. You've said all this already. This is the killer line. Or put differently, attempting to escape nature may well leave us at its mercy. So the idea that you could have an incredibly advanced, sophisticated post-work society where the robots do everything may, perhaps surprisingly, leave human beings uniquely incapable of solving existential threats like climate change or a pandemic, right? There have been far worse than what we had in the 2020s, if you go further back to Black Death and whatnot. And I thought that is just such a beautiful distillation and a real challenge. And then that got me thinking of the book Dune, which I talk about all the time. Sorry to sort of go on. There's an interview with you, not me. But it really got me thinking about Dune, where you're in the distant future, you have in some ways a post-scarcity society, but you still have what appears to us as actually concepts from the past: feudal houses, theology, religion, obligation, duty, which we don't really associate with liberal capitalist society. And maybe actually a distant future of technological abundance would need to have some of the conceptions and mental habits of the deep past in order for us to actually just survive, let alone thrive. And that is such a challenge to the idea of liberal progress, isn't it?
That's a really good point, a really good way to put it, Aaron. And I think you're absolutely right. And I think if there's one thing, perhaps a message I would say that comes out of my book is that is we have to, and I'm not being touchy-feely about this, but I mean, we have to be mindful of nature's presence in everything we do. And I think this idea, which is very common in liberal thought and certainly neoclassical thought, that we can emancipate ourselves from nature. That's the whole, in a sense, the whole human quest is to do that, to transcend nature so that we become its masters. And in a sense, artificial intelligence is a manifest, or not artificial intelligence, but the pursuit of artificial superintelligence or artificial general intelligence, as it's sometimes called, this kind of superhuman intelligence, which will now completely create this superintelligent being that is totally divorced from the physical world. Well, of course, as I point out to people, what good is a superintelligence if you can completely destroy it by unplugging it? I mean, it's incredibly energy intensive. That energy has to be produced in the natural world. And it's one of the problems that is emerging right now, for example, in the US, because it is going in, unlike the Chinese, which are going in for a different model of artificial intelligence, which is much more practical applications and embodied technology. The Americans are going headlong into the pursuit of the holy grail of this artificial superintelligence. And as a result, electricity bills are going up to 8% a year because it is sucking up so much, and it's going to get even worse. Natural gas prices are going up by even more. And so much so that in the November elections, the odds are growing that there will be a sort of populist backlash against the Trump administration that is going to have a strong component of anti-AI, sort of rein in the oligarchs, put a lot more controls on artificial intelligence, put limits on how many of these data centers they can build. So there's this, in a sense, a social feedback loop that results from this because of a complete denial of the role of nature. I'll tell you when this first came to my attention, Aaron, because of course, I'm living in developing countries, and I'm visiting my family in Canada, and this was about 20 years ago. I was in Canada during which there was a short-lived by about 2 days, but a completely generalized grid failure in New York and in Ontario and parts of Quebec, where I was then visiting. And so complete failure of the electrical grid due to software difficulties and feedback loops within that system. Now, living in a developing country, we deal with power failures all the time, and what you have backup plans in place, and you check on the neighbors. You see, when you get to the traffic lights, there's a kind of understanding among everybody. How do you proceed here? There's this, and so what appears to be like chaos is actually a sort of ordered chaos. It's a bit like any day in Naples, for example. But what I was struck by in a society that is highly developed and bureaucratized and highly, in a sense, emancipated from nature, when it suddenly finds itself thrust back at its mercy, it was sort of like within 24 hours, you kind of felt social order was collapsing. There was chaos. People going to the grocery stores, and of course, the freezers are all broken down. There's not enough fresh food, and they're starting to fight among themselves. And you realize that there is this kind of vulnerability that grows because people have put out of their mind, we ever have to deal with this. And when they're forced to deal with it, that's the kind of lack of resilience that I say can be a byproduct. It's perhaps not a product of development. You could still have fully automated luxury communism, provided I think there's this constant recognition of what nature's role in all this and our ultimate dependence on nature, because all the resources we're using to produce these, build these data centers are coming out of the earth, at the end of the day. And that has economic effects when you deplete those resources and when you're, as I say, increasing energy demand and if you're increasing carbon emissions as a result of the energy demands, that itself brings feedback loops. And all of those things, I think, are now belatedly entering into the calculus, but not always in a comfortable way for the dominant economic model.
That point about resilience and technology and where we're moving to, it feels like, with the dematerialization of the economy, digitization, a great example is cash. We have had physical cash for a really long time. Money is a better way of putting it. A means of exchange, which is also a store of value, like coins or more recently notes. And of course, now we're moving to a world of cashless transactions. But of course, if the electricity goes down, if your internet goes down, if for whatever reason there is, malware attack on the payment systems or whatever, if a company like Stripe or Apple Pay decides to withdraw from a country, then you can't do that anymore, And there is something to be said for physical cash, and it's something I've talked about with people before. They say, look, if you want a resilient society that's actually capable of withstanding these kinds of shocks, a certain percentage of the cash supply is going to have to be something that people have in their hands. Now, as a millennial who's a progressive, and I don't live in London, but I work in London, I barely touch cash, right? I don't touch it. I just use my phone. But, some of the guys I know in Portsmouth where I live, some of the people that live near me, some of the people I meet talking to my dog, they're tradesmen, all they have is cash. So it's a really different relationship to this object, which, like you say, in a crisis, all of a sudden changes everything. And it does feel like in the West, certainly below a certain age, that is the case with a lot of things. And again, reading the book, it did get me thinking. Of course, I don't think this is a refutation of Falk, but it would mean that you would have to have some kind of political education with the citizenry to inculcate resilience to crises and to problems. And of course, and I'm not defending the Cultural Revolution, it was insane. It was probably one of the most insane things of the 20th century, which, by the way, is really saying something. In 1 year, Chinese students got hold of 19 million guns, right?
Yeah.
But Mao said about the Cultural Revolution, you need something like this. He said, I think every 7 to 8 years, which again is insane. You need something like this every 7 to 8 years in order to maintain a revolutionary spirit within the Chinese people. Now, again, I don't agree with that. But if you read a book more recently called Mao and Markets, the experience of the Cultural Revolution massively shaped the business mindset of some of the most successful companies in China. They're risk averse. They're terrified about overly complex supply chains and things collapsing. They really focus on loyalty, leadership, collective identity, all of these things. And again, I'm not trying to defend the Cultural Revolution, but it's such an antithesis to what we have in the West, which is super isolation, just-in-time supply chains, collective identities don't matter. Actually, the family doesn't matter. And that's something I want to talk about in a moment, because I don't see how you can have a resilient society without families, and certainly without housing security. I think it's impossible. So is there something to be said for these kind of intermittent crises actually toughening up a citizenry? You know, it used to be something that conservative voting women like my mum would say in the 70s, the 80s, you know, what we need is a good war. That's obviously disgusting and ridiculous. But is there something to be said about these intermittent crises actually being quite useful for an otherwise successful high-income economy?
Well, I mean, yes, I think to the extent that, and one of the analogies I use in the book is that one of the ways this came to the attention of medical researchers was the awareness in sort of the last few decades, the increasing appearance of allergies, sometimes critical, fatal allergies in people that were showing up increasingly in large numbers in developed countries, but weren't showing up in developing countries. And this brought us back to the 19th century. You know, there's sort of, it was a French doctor who actually discovered that his patients who came from the nobility or from the urban bourgeoisie were coming in with a lot more illnesses than peasants who just seemed to be more resilient. And he attributed this to the fact that the peasants were living closer to nature and then were being subjected on a regular basis, exposure to various pathogens, and then just had a stronger immune system. And that has been, and I talk about that in the book, that has been transposed by some research to societies. What can the same be said of societies? Is there a certain amount of adversity that keeps a society primed? Rather like the way the Cultural Revolution, one could certainly say the Cultural Revolution was excessive. Was the principle wrong? Who knows? I can remember when I was working in Cambridge, putting to a colleague of mine who was a sinologist, would it have been possible to envision Deng Xiaoping and the reforms, the economic reforms that completely transformed the Chinese economy without the Cultural Revolution first? And the argument I suggested, I was just being provocative, was that you needed to actually stamp out the fissiparous tendencies in Chinese history, the strength of provincial barons who were always working at cross purposes to any kind of national planning. And he said there, he thought about it and he thought that's actually a plausible case. He'd heard that sort of argument made. So I'm not, again, like you, I would never make a case for the Cultural Revolution, but the idea of people being subjected to, and not avoiding adversity, because the idea of a shallow existence I talk about in the book, which is a reference to a popular American blogger's comment about this as utopia, basically, where, okay, we don't have the extremes of joy that we have when you go through agony that leads to ecstasy. It's sort of like going to a football game and knowing what the result is ahead of time. You don't have that terrible nail-biting worry, but it's not as fun at the end. But he says it's worth it because we do away with all these diseases and all these tragedies. And the question, that really raises a deep philosophical question, which I thought about treating in the book. And I thought, that's another book. It's a philosophical book. Of course, the romantics would have said, well, no. I mean, if you do away with tragedy, you're doing away with the very essence of human existence, of what makes us human and what makes it possible to experience joy. If you take away the experience of adversity, can you really even experience joy? So I didn't want to get into that in the book. I was really just interested in the question of, if you do this, are you going to create people that are still, in a sense, able to function, or would be able to function, in a world where systems were breaking down periodically. And I think that's something we have to be, look, it's happening already here in Britain. The water system periodically breaks down. The electrical grids are getting extremely strained. They probably will continue to function, but it's going to be at an increasing cost. And you will have periodic failures, as happened to me, all those years ago. How well will people be able to cope? And of course, you will have more of what we experienced with COVID-19. We might not have another global pandemic on quite that scale, but we will be continually exposed to new diseases, in particular tropical diseases migrating to temperate zones because of climate change, for example. How prepared are societies to deal with that? Developing countries have dealt with them. And of course, at one time, European countries dealt with malaria. It was just a fact of existence. Its eradication was a great achievement, but now it's going to come back. Are we actually going to be, we're going to have to relearn how to deal with these things, because we will not be quite likely in a situation where we can look to the state to do that for us. Bearing in mind that we live in an era, if the thesis is correct, and that chronic economic near stagnation is going to be the lot of developed countries, albeit at a very high level of prosperity. But if states are being forced to reduce their budgets on such things as healthcare in order to meet their growing defense obligations and the new commitments they're taking on, they're not going to be able to provide. If we were to have another COVID-19, Western countries wouldn't be in a position to provide the kind of financial assistance they did last time. That was a one-off. Are they really prepared for the next one, whatever that happens to be? And that's the sort of resilience I'm really interested in.
It's quite scary. You didn't mention melting permafrost, right? This is, again, another source of potentially
of methane being released.
Archaic, pathogens that we haven't seen for a very, very long time that could come back. And I think this is key. Not many people, maybe many people know this. I didn't know this until, basically until COVID, actually. But all of these pathogens are all a result of zoonotic spillover. So diphtheria, as I understand it, comes out of South Asia in about the 17th, 18th century, right? Ebola, obviously, HIV/AIDS, the Black Death. These are all the result of zoonotic spillover. And of course, we've had 3 novel coronaviruses in the last 25 years. And the claim is that, and it's been made by a ton of people on the left, people like Andreas Malm, and they talk about the increasingly rapacious nature that capitalism has to, the planet, and how this is only going to get worse. And I think, look, the evidence appears to suggest that is the case. And we're very lucky that, COVID-19 wasn't significantly worse. You could have a pathogen which spreads like COVID-19, but has the lethality, maybe not of Ebola, because of course, the more lethal something is, the less likely it is to spread. But you could have something pretty bad. And I think that rather than look at that experience of the early 2020s and say, we really got away with it, it does feel like the political and economic elites are saying, okay, let's just move on to business as usual. On growth, you mentioned the US already. You're saying that we're seeing a kind of ceiling to growth for wealthy countries. A few questions. So how does your diagnosis differ from people who talk about secular stagnation, which is to say we've reached a kind of steady state economy, but we'll still be wealthy, right? And that the whole planet is moving towards that, because that's quite an optimistic scenario. So how does your view sort of differ from that? But also on the United States, you're saying that it's not really growing. Actually, a lot of its growth is the result of debt. I mean, there's a statistic in here which says the US economy grew by, I think, 6 trillion between 2020 and 2024, but its debt increased by 12 trillion.
Right, yeah.
So the US isn't really growing.
No, not if you look at it that way. I mean, it is growing. It is growing in that, the GDP reports it. But it is doing it at tremendous expense. Now, the only way you can justify a $12 trillion investment for $6 trillion of growth is to say that a chunk of that $12 trillion investment is going to lead to a takeoff in the growth rate, which in the future is going to supercharge the economy, and then we'll grow so fast without having to add all this new capital, i.e., we are pouring all this money into this technological revolution, which is about to begin. Now, I have my doubts about that, Aaron, because I've been hearing that for the entirety of my adult life. It was Robert Solow back in the early 1980s who talked about, we see the computer revolution everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. And even those who write about every day or every couple of days, you can read in the Financial Times another article by someone saying it's happening. Now we're seeing the breakout in AI. It's leading to all these gains in productivity. These are by and large people who've been saying this for the last 30 years. Before it was AI, it was .com, it was the internet, it was new software. There was always some technology that's going to do it. And generally the pattern has been, we sometimes get no discernible change. We sometimes get short bursts of productivity gain, like in the late 1990s in the United States, late 1990s, early 21st century. And then it peters back out. And if you look at the long-term trend, productivity growth has not been growing. I am in the camp with Robert Gordon, who argues that, this dramatic growth in labor productivity, which we had from about the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century, we didn't move into a new era. There were three technologies essentially which transformed productivity. Those are in the past. There's no reason to believe any of the future ones will do it. AI will transform society in the same way the internet has, but a lot of the transformation in society of the internet hasn't actually led to an increase in economic productivity. It leads to a complete change in the way we communicate with each other, the way we're constantly online, the way if you make an appointment to meet somebody, you assume you each have a phone and you can find each other, and you don't sort of leave the house saying, meet me at this point at this time, and if you're not there, I'm going to assume you're not coming, that kind of thing. It's a good, so it's changed our way of life radically. But has it actually led to an increase in economic output that justifies the expense? That's questionable. I think what it has done is led to a concentration of the gains of growth into a smaller and smaller number of hands. So you get some phenomenally wealthy people who can say the technology has made them very rich, but it's also done much less perhaps for a lot of other people. So I think my own view is that, and I think this is actually showing up already in bond and stock markets, that I think investors are starting to call time on this. We're seeing it in the US that just in the last few weeks, for example, there's been a sort of a shakeout in the AI sector. The companies in the forefront of this, investors are starting to back away and saying, you keep promising this revolution. We're pumping huge amounts of money. We're yet to see the evidence. Show us the money. I don't think this $12 trillion justifies itself on those grounds. And I think that what is going to happen, and of course the Americans plan to keep doing this because they have assumed they could do it because they've been able to do it since the 1940s or since the end of the war. They have been able to borrow endlessly. The world has been able to subsidize that. And I think that patience is running out because there are frankly better opportunities elsewhere. So I think what is going to happen is that in the next year or two, you're going to see a slowdown in the American economy so it converges with what is happening in other Western countries. Some Western countries are going to experience a brief uptick in growth, like Germany will, because of the massive investment it is making in infrastructure and defense spending. But I'm not sure that's going to be a permanent raising of the growth rate. I think it'll be kind of, what economists would call a sugar high, and it will sort of run its course.
And of course, Germany's economy has basically been either, in decline or stagnating for
That's right.
the best part of 3 years at this point.
That's right. Yeah, in per capita terms, yes, it has been going backwards, and that's something I think which bears noting is when I was asked recently the question, is the economy going to go into recession? And I said, well, I think the way we actually ask that question is dated, because for a substantial part of the population, it is in recession. When we use aggregate figures, so the US is a good example of this. When you use aggregate figures, you can say, well, the economy is in very good shape. But when you look at public opinion surveys and how people feel about the state of the country and their own lives and where things are going, there's a great deal of gloom there. So what's the disconnect? Now, an awful lot of economists are still saying, well, people are wrong. We just have to educate them. We need better media to show them that the economy is doing well. Well,
the vibe session, right?
The vibe session, that's right. Yes. And is it that, or is it that, I think perhaps a lot of it has to do that economists need to get out a bit more and actually meet these people and find out why they're saying their lives aren't improving, because And that is happening. The research is getting more sophisticated, more nuanced at looking at, for example, the differential impact of inflation or the way people assess inflation. The notion that once a month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US or the ONS here in Britain comes out with a figure and says, this is the inflation rate. The notion that people judge, oh, okay, that's the inflation rate for this month. That's not how they do it. They look at it in the purchases they make on a daily basis and the items that matter to them. Being told that you can afford a hotel in Jakarta now, it's become very affordable. So that holiday package, or a holiday package in Bali is now very accessible. Isn't going to do you any good if you're not even in that. What you're concerned about is your gas bill, your heating bill, your electricity bill, and the grocery bill. And can you afford to take the children out, to have fish and chips, or has it become too expensive? And those are the things that in the US, for example, over the last couple of years, have become out of reach for people. So effectively, the fact that the economy isn't in recession for Elon Musk at all doesn't mean it's not in recession for a far greater number of people. And I think we need to have a more sophisticated understanding of what we're aiming for when we talk about growth, because we've been so fixated on growth as a metric for progress. And we've lost sight of that. Well, how is it affecting ordinary lives? And also a controversial question, is it always going to be better to add income? Is there some trade-off that, and you talk about family, Aaron, is one of the effects on family life of very rapid growth is it does weaken the family, mainly because of increased labor mobility. People have to look, people can and do go to where the opportunities are, and that creates a lot of, social mobility. There is a trade-off to that. There is something lost. In a sense, the vote for things like Brexit, the vote for MAGA, there was a motivation of just trying to preserve life within communities. I'm not suggesting that those were the right solutions at all, but I think the motive of many people supporting it was just, can we still have our communities? Can I still afford to go to the football match? Things like that are being lost in many ways as a result of growth.
If you look at Lula da Silva, one of the very few social democrat politicians these days, he was on the election trail the last time, and he said, I just want workers in this country to enjoy a picanha and a beer. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, that's it, right? It's not asking for the world, is it? I'm one of those people now. I'm 41. I'll be on Facebook, and I live in Portsmouth. I'm on the south coast. I'm on those Facebook groups where they're looking at nostalgic pictures, of Eastleigh and Southampton when they were building the Spitfires, or Bournemouth, where I'm from, or Portsmouth, where I now live. And I look at the images from before the war, or even after it, actually. Lots of it was just destroyed by city surveyors and people who wanted cars everywhere and whatnot. And it looks objectively worse now. I do coverage of things like by-elections and whatnot. I go outside the M25. I was recently in Manchester where they're having this by-election. And it feels like, I'm going to say something here, a third world country, only it's not, because I've been to third world countries and they're not that dirty, right? This is the thing, right? And something really strange is happening. I was in Levenshulme, which is part of this constituency that's going to have the by-election. There was rubbish everywhere, fly tipping everywhere. Now, of course, parts of Europe have that. I've seen it in Palermo. Palermo is just extraordinary, and that's partly about crime and the mafia. But then if you look at, for instance, photos of the DDR, and again, I'm not an apologist for the DDR, had some good things like childcare, had some bad things like, the Stasi. But if you look at the DDR, if you look at North Korea, immaculate surfaces, very clean public realm, the lighting looks nice, things just look clean and civilized. And something strange is going on where that's a poor, low-income country, and then I'm in somewhere like Levenshulme where I'm seeing just mattresses and nappies everywhere and just literally tons of rubbish in parks. The public realm is a complete mess. So that challenges me, and that makes me think, well, what is growth? What is a high-income society? I think you're absolutely right. Most parts of this country have been in a recession for a very long time. We don't talk about it nearly enough. And that even predates the global financial crisis. They've been in a recession for a very, very long time. So I suppose that's a big recognition for me. But also it feeds in against that issue of resilience. If you're going to outsource, if you're going to have private companies tasked with literally cleaning your streets, you are building in whatever the opposite of resilience is into your economic model. And if this is now the prism we're going to look at neoliberalism through, it feels like we're actually intentionally trying to make societies as, what's the antonym of resilience? irresilient, a-resilient,
Fragile, vulnerable.
fragile, right? Lacking in resilience or fragile as humanly possible. And answer me this, if you can. I mean, you're going to have a very smart, sophisticated sort of answer, I presume.
I'd like to think.
Answer me this. How come the more that politicians talk about community, the less there is actual community? Which is to say that where you have a housing insecurity, where you have people on 0 hours contracts, where you have people not in jobs for very long, where you have very weak family connections and ties, that's really the last 25, 30 years, that's getting really strong now, really profoundly strong. At the same time, particularly politicians on the centre left, they love to talk about community. Is there some connection here? Like the more it disappears, the more it's appealed to?
Well, I guess that's a natural instinct, isn't it, Aaron? I mean, if you're hungry, you talk about food. And, I think it's part of the process that if we're living in a time where community bonds are becoming weaker, and that is one of the elements of resilience I talk about in developing countries, that you have a very strong sense of neighborhood, not everywhere. I just think that in a situation, one of the things I have observed in decades of going back and forth between the global periphery and the core, if you want to use that terminology that we used in Why Empires Fall, when you have a weak state, you tend to have a strong society, is the way I would put it. It becomes necessary in the same way that, for example, if you know the police aren't going to show up when you call them, or you can't trust them unless you pay them a bribe, what do? Do you just sort of fatalistically accept the crime that's happened to you? No, you tend to work through community groups. It's not always the best way to do things, but it can be effective. And the same thing happens with, I can remember the very first time I lived through a hurricane, and when I was living in Jamaica, and a neighbor with whom I never got along ever, showed up, a few hours before the hurricane, say, do you need anything? We've got water stored and everything. Are you good? Or do you need anything? And I was struck by that. It wasn't done because suddenly they've decided to be my friend. They weren't. They went right back to arguing with me all the time as soon as the hurricane had passed. But it was a sense that if I don't do this for you, you're not going to do it for me, and we're both going to be cooked at some point. So that kind of call it neighborhood self-help, and it's actually fairly well researched, the ways in which, in the absence of really strong states, these kind of organizations, spontaneous organizations form that provide support and assistance. Very often in developing countries, it will be through some kind of religious organization, because people also tend to be much more religious in developing countries, so whether it's a mosque or a church or a synagogue or a temple, there is some kind of additional resource provision, basic welfare. And I think this is one of the ways in which, as it were, so one aspect of resilience, you have a state with a public healthcare system, well-funded hospitals, well-paid doctors, lots of nurses, that is suddenly overwhelmed. Is there a backup plan? When you contrast that with a society which doesn't start with that advantage. And so everybody knows that. So they already have a plan in place. What are we going to do if someone in the family gets sick? Well, first thing is make sure they don't get sick. Take whatever measures are necessary. And secondly, if they do get sick, what do we do? Well, you're going to have to rely on others perhaps to do the shopping or whatever, but there are these kind of spontaneous networks which exist. That's an example of social resilience that I talk about, as opposed to the formal sector resilience that we'd have here in Western countries. They have their own vulnerabilities, so I'm not making a case, let's all go back to being developing countries. What I am saying is I think there is, and one of the things that you definitely will find in developing countries is, as it were, a greater awareness of the natural limits on what you can do. If you live in a place where storms are a fact of life, you don't pretend that, we've transcended nature. You know full well that there are certain storms that there's nothing you can protect against. You're just going to have to deal with it afterwards. And that is, in a sense, we reached a level of development in Western countries that for a period of time, it seemed like we would be able to rise to every challenge which came our way. And then these novel challenges began emerging in the late 20th century with the advent of the growing awareness of how climate change would begin to have impacts, and is now having impacts the way that we'd get new diseases, new pathogens, antibiotic resistance, all these things, all of which can be dealt with, but they might not be dealt with the tools that we thought, just adding another, just expand the healthcare budget and we solve the problem. We're seeing that a lot of these don't have solutions that fit into the matrix we've been using for the last 2 or 3 generations.
Yeah. You see this with healthcare, right? So after 2020, there is a really big increase in healthcare spending in this country. I'm not going to say that very often about the Tories when they're in government. There just empirically is, and the outcomes aren't very good. And the argument that's been made by the left and centre left for the entirety of the post-war period is just, well, the more you spend on healthcare, the better. Well, yeah, I mean, to a point, but ultimately there's more to it than just that. You mentioned a writer earlier on, Robert Gordon. Is it The Rise and Fall of American Growth?
The Rise and Decline, I think, of American Growth, yeah.
It was about 10 years ago, I think it was published, right?
Big tome, very influential.
It's one of those I've got, but I haven't read it. I've read maybe
You're in good company, Aaron. I think most people who have it have got not far past the first chapter, but it's a very good book.
It's a bit like Thomas Piketty. Yeah, I've read about a third of it.
Yeah.
In that third, you do get the hypothesis. So he's saying that really you have these one-off technologies which are widely adopted in the middle of the 20th century. And there are other things too. You talk about them in the book. So just quickly, because look, for somebody watching this, my dad's born in 1956. He's not stupid, he knows things that aren't really going right, but he would say the world I've sort of become a person in and become an adult in, people were getting consistently richer, living standards were getting better, the future always seemed more bright, people's sort of kids, it was generally presumed, would have a better life than they did and certainly better than their own parents and their grandparents. So what's the rebuttal to that from somebody who's looking at Robert Gordon, saying actually this period from 48, particularly to 73, I think that's the periodization you have in this book. Why is this period so distinctive and why is it not coming back?
Why is it so distinctive? Who knows? We went from essentially, if you look at energy source, we go from essentially relying to a very considerable degree on what nature, provides in the form of wind, the sun, in the sense that, workday was during the day because, a very, very small amount of burning of carbon in the form of wood. And of course, water power, to suddenly the discovery that you can release all this stored energy from within the planet in the fossil fuel era, and then we're moving into a new era. And some would say that you can have endless growth if you move into renewable energy, because then you just have an energy supply which is endless. But I think there's another aspect that Gordon himself doesn't touch upon, but is very important. The thing about technology, Aaron, is it's not just the existence of the technology, it's how we use it. And this is very interesting right now during the AI race. If there is such a thing as an AI race, there are those who say there's no such thing. This idea that someone is going to get there first and win is just ludicrous. Once the technology is uncovered, it'll spread. Nevertheless, between the Chinese and the Americans, 2 different approaches. One of the big differences is that in China, the Chinese government is investing a lot of its time and resources into preparing students for the AI era. So, basically there's a lot more learning of, okay, how do you actually use this technology? What are the possibilities that it unleashes? How do you employ it? How might you actually develop your own applications? Whereas in the United States, again, it's very much, we're going to discover this technology, it'll transform everything. In fact, you'll be rendered useless. You don't even have a role to play in this, which is creating this kind of apocalyptic fear of AI, which is very interesting. Now, if you go back to the 1950s and the period, because that is really the dramatic time. That period, that generation that lasts from really about 1948 until about 1973, we're really talking about a 25-year period in which more growth occurred than had ever occurred before in human history. I mean, in any comparable period, by far. And an awful lot of models then predicted, well, this is going to continue endlessly. So we can afford to build this healthcare system because the resources will always be there. We can afford to provide retirement at the age of 65. So retirement goes from being something that you spend a couple of years collecting a pension to now you can actually start a whole new life and live your best life and all the rest of it, based on the assumptions that this growth would continue. But one of the things that happened in the war that people overlook is that you get, until 1945, most people are still entering the workforce in their teens with primary, maybe a bit of secondary, but not secondary qualifications, and very little tertiary. And what we know is that in education, there are diminishing returns, so that if you take somebody who's illiterate and you give them basic literacy, that brings about a very large leap in productivity. If you then add numerical skills, you bring them up to a secondary diploma, that makes it possible for them to do, because they can actually use the technology. Apart from anything else, you can give them the manual to read how to operate this machine. They can understand, they can read the numbers and figure out, do their own maths. And that creates a whole transformation that occurs after the war, because what you get is the movement from a population which is primarily educated to a primary level and then entering the workforce to one that is now increasingly getting secondary diplomas. As you get to university, you still get a productivity gain in the undergraduate degree, but it's a much smaller return. And that's the period we move into from the 60s to the 70s, the growth, the spread, which is, one can make an argument that was a good thing to happen in and of itself, but it's not really one that you can justify economically. And then when you get to the kind of things you and I did with our lives, which is going on to advanced studies, realistically, I think we're probably better thinkers for it, Aaron, but we aren't actually more productive. There's almost no productivity gain. So there's a great deal of investment that was made in education, which made it possible for people, as particularly electrification then is now spreading, they can then basically operate this technology in a way that's highly productive. Today, we don't get that. There's really no return left to be had because of the achievement of the post-war period, because we have universal mass literacy to a fairly high level. So we're not going to get those incremental gains anymore from these technologies. Now, as I say, we could probably do a better job of preparing young people to enter the workforce if it's going to be transformed in some way by artificial intelligence, but we're not. We're kind of leaving them to their own fate. You graduate, good luck. AI is going to take your job. There's not much you can do. There's a real fatalism attached to this. Young people, it's a punishing job market here in Britain. You have something like I was reading the other day, a 20% unemployment rate among new graduates, at least for a time. They generally do get jobs, but that is a real dead weight on society. And what they should be, I think should be done is that the government should be actually smoothing their transition. They should be funding or incentivizing businesses to give them internships during which they learn AI skills so they can adapt and then, carry whatever employer they're going to go work for, carry them into this new age. But we're not doing that. We're leaving it to the market to do it. And that's never a good way to manage these kind of transitions. Coming back to the original question, I think there was something really dramatic about that post-war period, that there was a confluence of two factors. One, this technology, particularly the spread of electrification, which made possible all sorts of other technologies, with mass education to, secondary level. I think it's that, and that can't be replicated. So I think, searching for what is the holy grail that's going to enable this next leap, we're saying, this can only go on for so long.
I think one of the best reflections of this period, which is called the Great Acceleration, which arguably starts in 1950. Obviously these trends go back a really long way, but basically every trend from plastic consumption to water consumption to population to just everything is this J curve, right? And that's now over, basically, for most of the world, not everywhere, but most of the world, certainly in Britain and Europe. And that's now over. I think one of the best depictions of that in the wider culture, and this idea that would just go on forever, this takeoff, is Isaac Asimov with the Foundation series. It's set in the distant future, and you have planets, with like trillions of people. The universe has quadrillions of humans, as if the fertility rate would just stay the same, and you'd have basically exponential growth. And we know that hasn't happened. But that's exactly what we think is the case with economic growth. Mm-hmm. We still think in Isaac Asimov's terms, right? Well, actually, the universe should have quadrillions of human beings, just like we're meant to have 2-3% GDP growth into perpetuity. And this sounds so simple and straightforward and obvious, that these productivity gains of the 20th century are one-off, they're not coming back. Urbanization, women in the labor market, electrification, secondary education, they're big. Mm-hmm. You might get some, little knickknacks here and there, but you're not going to get something like those all at once ever again. And of course, the Industrial Revolution starts 1780s with steam, but it's electricity and electrification which modularizes and condenses this power source into things like, a drill or a phone or a camera. Like the electricity element of it is really huge. And from what I remember of Robert Gordon, that's, one of the big parts of that book. Talking about this period as well, and I think this book is really a kind of a response to the Great Acceleration and the end of that moment, which our political class is just not willing to accept. My grandmother was born in 1926. She was born the same year as Queen Elizabeth II, the general strike in this country. Hitler had just come out of prison, I think a year earlier. She died in 2023. Now, when she was born, as I understand it, the planet had around 2.5 billion people. And when she died, it had 8 billion people. That's never going to happen again. In a single human life, the planet's population almost quadrupled. Mm-hmm. I think it was basically 2 billion to 8 billion. That's never going to happen again. But the kind of cultural software that we have in our politics in the West is that that's just going to carry on forever. And even though we've been in this kind of 20-year period of actually, we should have kind of sussed out by now that isn't the case, we have this kind of set of stories which thinks that if that isn't happening, something's gone wrong.
Something's gone wrong, yeah.
And I think that really is what drives Trump, what drives Brexit. Why isn't the world like it was, as you said, between 1948 and 1973? Very concrete material reasons why it ain't coming back. But then, of course, you want the answer, and the answer becomes DEI spending in local government. It becomes immigrants. It becomes all manner of things. Some are more valid than others. DEI spending in local government is not going to bring back the 1960s boom. And it astonishes me, speaking to people such as yourself, who make this so obvious, it astonishes me that the political class still aren't coming to terms with this. Just today, Robert Jenrick, who's now the Shadow Chancellor for Reform, has said they're not going to get rid of the triple lock on pensions, right? So you want no migration, which even if you think that's a Ponzi scheme to pay off pensions in the future, which it kind of is, right? You don't want the immigration, but you're going to keep the triple lock. How? And on the one hand, we think that means there's a real inconsistency with right populism and they can't solve these problems. But, John, this has been going on for 20 years. There's this age cohort, particularly amongst the over 60s, not all of them, obviously, but they can't get their heads around the fact that the world, on the one hand, I understand this, that's all they've ever known, but the world isn't going to be like that in the future. It wasn't like it before they were born, and it won't be like it after they're gone or after I'm gone. But politically, it seems so hard for so many people to grasp. Why is that? Is it just we haven't got better stories? Is it a failure of politicians and politics? Is it a failure of the left? Why has this story remained so strong and core to our identity in the West?
Well, you're a parent, Aaron, and I don't know if you've ever had the experience of promising one of your kids something that you think you're going to be able to deliver and then finding out over time, actually, I think I probably overpromised, and how do you work it back? It's not very easy. But at least your child doesn't have a vote. You can't say, well, I'm getting a new father. Thank you very much. I'm going to get one who will keep the promise. I think that we, and in a way, really, we're honest about this. There was a generation after the war who made themselves promises. The state will be able to do this, or the system will be able to do this for me when, I'll be able to retire and I'll be able to maintain or even improve my standard of living upon retirement, do all the things, have a bucket list of all the things I ever wanted to do. And those promises can't be kept. And the problem is, in other words, if we accept the reality that, okay, we're living in a world of 1% growth. And I remember having this conversation with you, Aaron, when we talked about why empires fall, because you put the question, it sounds rather gloomy. What is the scenario? And I say, well, think about this, Aaron. Think about, if you had told not your grandmother, but your great-grandmother or your great-great-grandmother, I'm going to be living in a world of endless growth at 1%. And you describe the standard of living that has already been attained in this society, they would have said, this is utopia. Why on earth are you arguing and saying, we've got to blame these people because we can't do what we want? They'd say it's ludicrous. I think the fundamental problem is you can do an awful lot with endless growth of even 0.5% per year. If it's per capita growth, that's phenomenal achievement in the context of human history. The problem is if you promise one group, well, your growth, your expectations will be premised on growth of 5%. That means you have to take that from someone else. And that's what we're doing. I would say the adherence to the triple lock is because nobody wants to tell what is a large and politically active in terms of voting, but share of the population, you know what? We made a promise we can't keep. So what they do is they keep the promise, at least for now. I mean, the triple lock will go one day. It will go because it will collapse under the weight. And everybody knows that. And Generic, if he has any modicum of intelligence, knows it. So essentially they're lying. And what they're doing is, of course, they're shifting the burden onto young people. And there's ways you do it. You can do it through simply cutting the budgets. You no longer fund higher education. You give young people massive student loans that they're never going to repay. That system is, Martin Wolf had a good piece in the FT the other day just saying, it's a completely unsustainable system. But the other thing you can do is, to a very considerable degree, the private pension system depends on asset values rising at a rate of growth considerably higher than the economy's. How do you do that? Well, since the financial crisis, that's been done largely through increasing the money supply much faster than the growth in the economy, which means asset values have inflated, which means that, again, a young person trying to buy a house can't afford it anymore. That's just beyond their reach. Or the rents they have to pay they're being squeezed. Considerable part of their income is going to paying rent to support a class who depends on that asset growing in value 6 or 7% a year, because that's the promise they've been made. Their retirement will be funded by that. I think we just need politicians with courage to say to the public, this is the choice, do you? And I look, I don't think it's an impossible sell to ask people to say, well, would you take a reduction in your standard of living? Because people do it all the time. If you ask any of those retired people collecting pensions that are locked in with the triple lock, not any of them, but most of them, I think if you said, when they were young parents, would you have set aside a chunk of your income, foregone consumption, in order to put some money aside for your child? They would do it. Selling it is, are we willing to make changes today to give our children and grandchildren the opportunity that you had? We're not going to promise them the pension you have because, frankly, you can't retain that pension. You're going to have to take a cut. I think people would be open to that, but for whatever reasons, the political class just cannot wrap its head. So they continue lying, which is what they do. They continue saying we're going to do it, knowing full well somebody else is going to have to scrap the triple log pension. Every single one, including the chancellor, knows that. It's going to be scrapped one day. Why we don't, and the longer we postpone that decision and decisions like that, the tougher it's going to be for some future politician.
You answered the question, but also, we're answering why it doesn't happen, right? Because, of course, those politicians right now would lose if they were being that honest with that section of the population. There's that line by Max Planck, or it's attributed to Max Planck, isn't it? Scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, I'm not suggesting, I don't want anybody to die. Don't clip me out of context. But the reality is that until the beneficiaries of this very broken status quo, until they become a minority, or at least a less strong voting bloc in the West, which will happen, I think. But until that time, it does feel like political solutions simply won't emerge. If you look at some of the conversations about the future and the past, for instance, again, this is, I think, a lesson that the left can take from the right, or at least conservative thinking. Not the right, because the right isn't conservative. They're liberals in many ways. We should be good ancestors, right? There's that line about planting a tree so that your descendants can sit in its shade and so on. And again, the West has completely lost the capacity to think in these terms. And a part of the reason why is because, again, of that story, we're talking about all these stories, that story of time and the present and everything being an eternal present, and the future and the past are kind of just extensions of the present, and actually the present is better than the past and the future will be better than the present. And Patrick Deneen, who's a conservative thinker, I don't know if you're familiar with this guy. He's a conservative Catholic thinker. I don't agree with him on many social issues, for instance, but he says that liberalism has this unique understanding of time which means it's impossible for us actually to think in the long term to be good ancestors and to think about, well, what kind of political and economic setup do I want for my kids, my kids' kids, my kids' kids' kids, people going forward hundreds of years. And, there's that pithy distillation, which is, how did these people build Durham Cathedral or Salisbury Cathedral? It was because they thought about eternity, not the next quarter. And I do feel like the West needs a dose of that, right? We need to start thinking about eternity, not the next quarter. And of course, again, that's coded in quite a right way. But I feel like the Green Left particularly, and this idea of becoming reacquainted and reconnected to nature, I don't see why a Green Left politics couldn't seize that mantle, right? Of a much deeper relationship to time. But anyway, that's
it's a very good point. I think you're absolutely right. I think we have lost that, and I think it's absolutely vital. I mean, I myself look at some of these cathedrals, not just cathedrals, but all sorts of other monuments built by our ancestors centuries ago that have stood the test of time. And you sort of say, well, what architectural marvel today is going to be here in 800 years? Nothing being built today will be here in 800 years. And one of the things I often think of is we can attach a name to all the great buildings being built today. We know who the architect is. We know the engineering firm. Their name is on it. And very often, if it's a public building or a university building, it has a benefactor's name on it. None of those buildings in antiquity have names attached to them. I think that's the other thing. There was a sense that you were building something that was not only going to outlast you, but embodied something far greater than you, that you're submerged in that identity. And I think...
Which again, is at odds with liberal epistemology, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I have been reading lately, For Whom the Bell Tolls by Ernest Hemingway. And of course, set in the Spanish Civil War. And one of the things that strikes me about it, and again, not something I'm advocating a return to, but one of the things that always comes back to me is that these, in the 1920s and 1930s, this young American who goes to fight in the Spanish Civil War and is quite resigned to the fact he's fallen in love with this Spanish woman and he's got this task to do, which is to blow up a bridge. And he's quite resigned to the fact, he's deeply in love. He said, we're going to get married. And he has this, these romantic notions of going and settling with her in the American Midwest and having this idyllic life. But he also knows that he's going to be dying that night in this, that it's more or less a suicide mission, which he will do because it's what must be done, for humanity. And I think that is the thing that I think has been lost with the ascent of, the end of history liberal view, which is it all comes down to the individual. And the whole politics that came with that in the 1990s around that politics of triangulation and it very much appeal to people's self-interest and build a coalition that allows you to, come up with a set of policies that satisfies this group and this group and this group and this group as individuals. And I think we need politicians who will articulate a vision and say, because as I say, I don't think most people actually live that way. Coming back to this illustration of people retired people who have a very comfortable lifestyle and see that their grandchildren are unemployed for long periods of time. They can't afford houses. What are they doing? Well, they're helping them, the bank of mom and dad, or now the bank of grandma and grandpa. They will make those sacrifices. I think what we need to do is sort of say, well, listen, if your child is going to grow up to live in a functional society, we need those privileges to be available to people who don't have a bank of mom and dad to turn to. Can you make that, adjustment to benefit them? Because your children will be happier living in that society if they don't have to live in a gated community. And I think it's really just a need. Now, we might be seeing glimmers of that. It's interesting. As you know, I was born and raised in Canada, and I go back there each year to visit my family. And it is interesting observing what has been happening in Canada since Trump came back to office and said, I'm going to annex Canada. And Canadians are saying, well, we have to go off in an entirely different direction. This will entail sacrifice. And there seems to be a willingness, from what I can tell. Not many people are saying, no, the price is too high to pay. Let's just submit to the Americans because we got a good deal. We're comfortable. I think that perhaps we're living in a time, because we are being confronted with these very difficult choices, that there's a willingness to entertain them that perhaps a leader like Mark Carney is articulating and people are resonating with, and we don't have strong leadership yet in Britain, anybody willing to actually do that kind of message, which is it's about more than you. It's about your family, it's about your community, it's about this country, and about the world in which you live. I think it's possible to do that. It's happened before, and I think there's a willingness. I think one of the great missed opportunities came in the pandemic. I do remember in the earlier stages when, one of the few things that Boris Johnson said that I regarded highly at the time, it didn't last very long, but he said, I think we can all agree there is now such a thing as society. I think that was a very powerful statement. The real pity is they didn't follow up with that. They very quickly went back to trying to use the usual politics of divide and conquer. But I think that there is, amid crisis, I think people are willing to look at their dependence on others and the dependence of others on them. And I think there would be an audience for this message. I think what we need is people to deliver that message.
And what it is going to require, particularly for people on the left, is just a break with liberalism. And I don't mean social liberalism. I don't mean, letting people just live their lives and getting on with things, but a break with liberalism as a politics that consists purely on the fulfillment of the individual and a complete, renunciation of obligation and duty, unless they're voluntary, entirely voluntary. We're wrapping up now, but you mentioned architecture, and I love a good rant on architecture. I don't know if you saw this the other day, this new building in Florence. Have you seen this?
No.
It's like a big black cube. It's horrific. And it's literally a stone's throw from the River Arno. I mean, it's probably about 30 meters from the River Arno. And like you say, nobody in 100 years is going to be looking at that and thinking, what a building. And I do look at some of this stuff and I just think, I think people are going to look at this period in the future as a period of really a dark age. Wow, all this pornography, all this gambling, all these excesses, all these kids were on their phones all the time, all this polarization, all these ugly buildings. What were they thinking? What were they doing? And I'm guilty of that as well. I get my update on screen time every Monday. I'm part of that as well. I'd like to think that somebody in the future will be thinking, wow, this is crazy time. What on earth are they doing? And also, we talked about, the Great Acceleration. I think one of the reasons why they were knocking down so many gorgeous buildings or just building roads through cities like in Glasgow was they thought, well, we'll have this growth forever. You know what? If it doesn't work out, we'll just build something else. But we now know it didn't work out that way. You said in one interview, politics is a vocation. To do it well is an underappreciated skill.
Yeah.
What skills do politicians need if they're going to be good?
I think intuition, actually. It's really the best politicians I've ever encountered are people who aren't necessarily... I actually think Mark Carney may be an exception because he may be the man for the moment. But by and large, I think politicians who are highly educated aren't always the best because they don't necessarily have that intuition. I think it's something, for example, that Donald Trump has. It's a tragedy he's using it the way he does. But his ability, the way in which he completely destroyed the model, the sort of the data science triangulation approach that the Democrats were so convinced. They were utterly convinced in 2016 they were going to win because all of the polling suggested it, all of the focus groups were saying it. And this guy's just going before big crowds and talking off the cuff and, picking up what the vibe is. I think that's an amazing gift. As I say, it's a tragedy he's used it for the purposes he's used it. But I think that is a gift. I think it comes from, it helps to like people. It helps to enjoy spending an awful lot of time just listening to people. And of course, the ability to communicate is vital. I mean, you can be very good at, and this is the big difference between Bill and Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton has a reputation as being a terrific listener, but she's not a very good communicator, and her husband was. And again, I think it's a bit of a tragedy what he used his skills for, because I think he could have done so much more than he did. But I think those are the key things, is that ability to connect with the people in a kind of organic sense, in a visceral sense, and to communicate to them, I think, and I think not to, it's a terrible thing, I'm using all these cliches, but the kind of to not lead from the back, but to actually get out ahead and say, to come up to craft a message, which is not what the people, not to say what are the polls saying that the people want, and I'll give that to them, but to actually say, this is what I have to say. What does this country need? What does this community need? This is what it is, and to be able to speak that truth. I think that's been sorely, and that's, I think, the vocation that Max Weber talked about in that, that essay, famous essay of his, Politics as Vocation. I think that's lacking today, and we need more of that.
Do you feel sorry for young people today? Because, you've got kids, you've got, I think, one grandchild?
Yeah, one grandchild. Well, two. I mean, a step-grandchild, yes.
Do you feel sorry for young people?
I do. I think I feel very strongly about this, Aaron. This is, being a writer, I still carry a notebook, and in my notebook I have a photograph of this very little granddaughter, who's just this wonderful, beautiful little girl. Was born last year, and I do that deliberately because I remind myself everything I have to do, if I can't somehow feel that I'm in some way doing what I can to try and see that she does inherit a world that is going to be remotely like the world I inherited. That I was born in a time when I wasn't saying I was not born in that time, and that I did not benefit from that period of phenomenal growth. But there wasn't this sort of sense of very limited horizons or possible imminent catastrophe that young people are growing up with. And the number of things that have been removed from them in order to maintain the privileges of older generations. In terms of, as I say, the debt load they carry coming out of university, the job market they enter being far more unforgiving than it was. I mean, the stories, my parents emigrated to Canada in the 1950s, and the stories I hear of immigrants of their generation going to Canada, you didn't need to have a university degree. You didn't need to have a thick CV. You didn't even need to have a CV. You could walk into jobs if you were willing to work and you're ambitious, and you could rise the ladder and do pretty well. I mean, that's just not open to young people today. And I think a lot of that is not, we hear it's attributed to all technological change and economic change, but a lot of it is policy choices we've made in order to reserve those benefits to a certain share of the population at the expense of the others. And I think that's just wrong. And I think we're paying a price for it in that it is having, young people, more and more young people aren't having children. The society can't sustain itself unless it's going to have recourse to immigration, which it doesn't want to do. It can't sustain itself if there aren't children. And one of the reasons they're not having children is just because of this. They can't start households. They can't start families. They can't give them that life, and they don't want to do it until they can. So I think we're paying a high price for this, and we really need to change that. As I said in the earlier part of the interview, I think most people would entertain that possibility. We lack good leadership. We really do lack good leadership, I think, and that's what's needed.
Favorite bookstore in the world?
Favorite bookstore in the world? Now, I know quite a few. I mean, the old Foyles I used to love hanging out in.
The cafe?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, and just wandering around. I used to go in, cold days in winter and just sitting in there and just immersing yourself in this environment. Even if I wasn't looking at the books, I was bringing my own book. Just that freedom, you could, go and sit there. I haven't been there in years. There's a little bookshop in Johannesburg, though, called Love Books. And to me, it's a testament to what is a kind of lost love here in Western countries, but you still find in developing countries. This book was founded by a journalist who in her 30s just decided, I love books. I'm going to open up a bookstore. And she opened up a bookstore. The kind of thing that you can still do in developing countries, but the simple reason that real estate costs are so low. It's simply not possible to envision that. Setting something up because of a love of books. You have to have a business model, and you have to move an awful lot of copy, which means you're going to be dealing with the major distributors selling the main, the blockbuster books, and the idea that you will have literary events and having writers come in. I think that is, it still thrives in many parts of the world, but I think in big cities like London, you get less and less of that. I mean, you get them. You get into good independent bookstores, but they struggle.
This is key, right? So these very high GDP countries, which talk about fostering entrepreneurship all the time, and it's central to the sort of political identities of the main parties, are the least entrepreneurial societies by design. They don't allow it because every business, when you walk down the high street, is owned by asset managers and their chains and their identikit. And it's wild. We have these stories and these myths which in no way map onto reality. And I think that's true. I think there's lots of young people now, and I hear it all the time. Poland's a good example, right? It's a middle-income country, but it's basically a rich country now. But they go to somewhere like Poland, they say, well, I see people my age starting bookshops and cafes and restaurants. I can't do that in London. I can't do that in Manchester. I can't get the capital. The rent costs are too high. And I think that's just that is such a profound challenge to our identity as apparently a capitalist country which loves markets and hard work and innovation and entrepreneurship. It's all bullshit.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in the previous one. I remember you saying that.
Yeah.
You saying about how there's more entrepreneurship in like Jamaica and South Africa than there are
because
in
the
Western
barriers to
countries.
entry are so much lower. I mean, if all you have to do is muster, not a peppercorn rent, but you can sort of pocket some savings, and it also just means that, I mean, one of the things, for example, that and this is where I think I am critical of the left in Western countries in this regard. They'll just say, well, workers in China, everything is so cheap from China because Chinese workers are so badly paid because they're exploited. Or workers in South Africa, a country I know particularly well, workers in South Africa are so badly paid. Well, you say, yeah, but part of the reason their pay is so much less is because the cost of living is so much less. Because the thing is, if their house costs a third of what the house here does, or even it's actually more like a sixth, or the shop premises they have to rent to run a business costs a sixth, not only do you have to pay your workers less, but you have to charge less for your product and you can have more customers. It's so much easier to set up a business. And now the reason rents have become so expensive is in no small measure because that is a significant part of the income that's generated to support through, and of course, a lot of institutional investors, a lot of hedge funds own real estate, but the hedge funds themselves, the primary owners of hedge funds are pension funds. That's what it's doing. Ultimately, it's sort of, a lot of the evictions, people would be appalled and, good, enlightened, liberal people would say, well, it's terrible the way these hedge funds evict these poor tenants in order to spruce up a property. Well, why are they doing it? They're doing it because they can get higher rent because their investors demand it. Their investors demand it because their clients demand it because they want to be kept in the standard to which they've grown accustomed. So that inhibits, and that is one of the things, I do talk about in the book, that it does inhibit that new dynamism. I have a former research assistant in South Africa, and he worked in a bank, and he just decided, you know what, I want to set up my own business. So he just left and set up his own business. It's a bit of a struggle at first because he's basically making his petrol money and his rent, but not much more. But he's able to run a business. It's that simple. You tell a young person, why don't you just quit your job working for Barclays and set up a business? And they're not going to live. It's going to be extremely difficult in most of Britain. I mean, there might be places you can pull it off, but they probably don't also have a large clientele to serve.
That's true, but it's exactly true. People say, "Oh, well, independent bookshops are kind of on the rise," but bookshops are dying because of Amazon. Well, no, there are a ton of young people who'd love to quit their corporate job and open up a bookshop in a provincial town or city, but they can't because of the rent costs. I mean, it's just a conversation nobody has, and we'd have so many beautiful businesses which they would keep a few people in employment and they would contribute to the social capital of an area and so on. We don't do it. Anyway, just to circle back to the thesis of the book, why are we talking about all these things? It's precisely that liberal sense of self, that emptying out of community, which makes our societies less resilient, less able to address these existential challenges. I want to finish on a sort of historical question, because this might sound abstract, or I think maybe in the case of the UK, it's not. I mean, it's quite clear, I think, where the difficulties are. But name me some societies which were economically successful but lacked resilience, maybe were fragile. Equally, are there any societies historically which were actually far more resilient than they deserved to be because of their cultural software? Maybe they were less wealthy than a rival state, but they had resilience and were more kind of capable of fending off crises.
Well, I think we're living through that moment right now, Aaron. I would say that I think some of the countries that did the worst in per capita terms in the pandemic were some of the richest, including Britain. And some of the ones that did the best, South Sudan, for example, came through the pandemic in relatively good shape. Now, some of that was just down to the fact that it's a very poor country, and so you don't have a high degree of urbanization. So there was the vectors of transmission were much lower. But that wasn't the case in much of, in many African countries and many Asian countries, particularly in India, where you had highly urbanized societies. But I remember talking with an Indian colleague of mine, well, more than one, talking with a number of Indian colleagues at the time of the pandemic, and how were people coping? And just talking about the mitigation measures, the adaptation measures that people naturally use. Again, living in a poor country, the things you grow up with, the things that your mothers and your grandmothers tell you, what to do. I mean, simple illustration is just about anybody who goes shopping in a market in Africa or in any developing country in Jamaica, they come home. There's all sorts of, even for example, my daughter's godmother saying she would never think to put her purse on a table, on a surface in which she would eat, because the purse might have been in contact with something. There's this fastidiousness. You wash everything. You wash your hands. You wash your food before you prepare it. Even if you're cutting a fruit, the knife cutting through the peel could encounter germs and then sort of infect the fruit. So there's this degree, as I say, of fastidiousness you get in very poor countries, which means that when faced with these kind of disease outbreaks, they're very resilient. I remember at the very early stages of the pandemic, a journalist from Ghana who was going to a meeting. He was covering a meeting, some international meeting, which happened to be taking place in Brussels. This is before the declaration of the pandemic had even begun and before there were any lockdowns in Europe. As soon as he got to the airport, all the airport staff were fully clothed in protective gear, and all the passengers were tested. He got to Brussels, and they would just wave through in the crowded streets and everything. And he said the bars were full, and he just was astonished. He said that people were taking no precautions. Well, Belgium didn't do particularly well in the pandemic. There was this expectation, well, we're a wealthy society, and if something goes wrong, there's a system in place to take care of me. And when that system broke down, there wasn't really a fallback initially. So I think that in that sense, historical, I would say, there is such a thing as too much stress for a society. A society that's subjected to repeat stress can eventually collapse. But a certain amount of adversity, as it is for a human body, I mean, being subjected repeatedly to infection, before you've shaken off one, you catch another, is going to eventually debilitate you. But a periodic exposure to viruses, to pathogens, to illness is, as we know, it tends to prime the immune system, and it keeps people relatively fit. In the same way that, this is the hygiene hypothesis, right? That, we've all excessively sanitized our food. Occasional bout of, stomach trouble isn't actually necessarily bad for the human body. We think it is. Any sign of an illness is a bad thing. But, you live in a developing country, and it's one of those things. Your children are going to periodically have, what in Jamaica we call running belly. They get over it, and they're resilient, but they grow up to be adults who can eat just about anything. So I think that there is something about, and the thesis in the book is that gaining too much distance from nature, and the pursuit, which I would call the liberal dream, which is to completely emancipate yourself from nature, that humans rise completely above nature. And now, of course, artificial intelligence in this vision will do that for us. It will be absolutely separate from nature. And I'm saying at the end of the day, in the same way that the triple lock pension will go, nature will come back. It will call us back if we try and neglect it. So I think being aware of the limitations it can impose upon us is the one thing that I think will sort of inculcate resilience, is just that respect for the power it has, which when you live in a developing country, you naturally form because you're exposed to nature's vagaries so often.
Is there not a historical example? Come on, this is when we need Peter Heather.
Yeah,
right.
No.
The Western Roman Empire.
You do need Peter.
The Western Roman Empire versus the Eastern Roman Empire.
It wouldn't be the Western Roman Empire versus the Eastern.
Because the East was wealthier, I know.
It would be the empire against the peoples on its boundaries, and I think that's where. And I was thinking of that example as.
And they would be more resilient to pandemics and whatnot than the Western Roman Empire. Right?
I think so. In part, that would have had to do with population density, I think, would be less globalized. So they were less exposed to the germs that are coming in from all over the empire, much more localized population. I think also just exposure to conflict, to warfare, against the people that have been sort of sheltered by the legions for so long, they're not prepared to deal with, what happens when order collapses and all these shaggy hordes come in. What do you actually do with them? Whereas they were accustomed to dealing constantly with the ravages of the legions. So they had that kind of ability to anticipate, to work with that. That, I think, would be the example which immediately comes to mind. I was reluctant to use it just because I thought I really need to run this by Peter, but Peter isn't in the room right now. But I will be running it by Peter and saying, does this work? I suspect he would say it does, but I'm not going to speak for him.
I like that. Maybe that's the next book. Have you read Aurora by Kim Stanley Robinson?
I have not.
Have you not?
I know it, but I know of it. But
it's kind of a piece with this hypothesis. It's about a multi-generational, what would you call it, space voyage to another planet like Earth, because Earth has various problems. They get to this other planet. I'm going to ruin the plot, whatever. It's one of his lesser-known novels. And people just start mysteriously dying, and they realize it's because of some kind of organism which they can't even see or comprehend. They have no idea, but it's a hypothesis that it must be something that's killing us. So they leave and they go back to Earth again over multiple generations. And it's just such a useful corrective to people like Elon Musk just saying, well, we just colonize Mars.
You're right, yeah.
And, no, our relationship to nature is nothing like that. Anyway, that's a book recommendation. This has been fabulous. The book is great. Read it alongside Why Empires Fall. John, thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Aaron.